Hello, I'm Emma-Louise Coffey and you're welcome to the Dairy Edge, the Teagasc Dairy podcast. We're bringing you the latest information, insights and opinion to improve dairy farm performance. On this week's episode, we are covering all you need to know about Nitrates Derogation with dairy advisor Mark O'Sullivan. Mark documents new regulations on liming, low emission slurry spreading, ration specs and grassland management.
The NAT4, the Nitrates Action Plan, is part of the Water Framework Directive, which allows farmers to farm over and above 170 kgs nitrogen per hectare or 2 dairy cows equivalent, subject to additional measures designed at protecting the environment and waters. I suppose the current environmental challenges and the continued disimprovement in water quality, it is considered prudent to initiate a review in advance of submitting the application in 2021. So I suppose the purpose of the review is improving efficiencies and continue to reduce on an environmental footprint, with particular emphasis on the water, climate, air quality, nutrient use efficiency, and an added element of biodiversity. And I suppose the goal, the measures introduced, to further protect our water quality and to assist with the application for the NAP5, which will be kicking off next year. The application will be going in.
Now, Mark, we'll run through some of the key changes and the key practices farmers are going to look to implement, but it is essentially going to be a quick fire round and you're going to answer them for us. So I suppose looking firstly, there are some new guidelines around liming that have been introduced from the start of this year. I suppose firstly, can you outline what those changes are?
Okay, I suppose so. The first thing is compulsory liming program, and when we hear the word compulsory, we think it's a bad thing. Quite the opposite with lime. So we know that around 50% of the soils that have been tested are suboptimum for pH. So in order to unlock this potential and release nutrients, the liming program has been brought in, which is basically a recommendation to spread the requirements for lime on your farm. So over a 4-year period, it's recommended to front load the requirement. So if there's a 2 tonne per acre requirement for lime, ideally this should be spread and front loaded in the first 2 years over the 4-year cycle of the soil sample. I suppose on the ground, the different types, the ground limestone and the grand lime, we always get this debate. The ground limestone, well, it's much cheaper than your grand lime. It's designed so the first a third of the lime, which is basically from grit or from dust up to grit, a third of it will be fast releasing, and then it's designed, the ground limestone, to be slow releasing for the next 2 years, whereas your grand lime is very finely ground at 0.1 of a mil and then pelleted, so it's faster acting. One thing to bear in mind with the ground limestone over the grand lime is really it's only a maintenance product and ideally should only be used really on hilly ground or where you can't actually spread your ground limestone. And from a point of view of build up for pH, your ground limestone and grand lime should be used in the same ratio, so the same quantities for build up. Your maintenance, you get away with maybe a third going with the grand lime.
And talk through the rates that you'd use, Mark. Okay,
so normally, depending on your samples, but generally speaking, 2 tonne per acre is about the recommended. High molybdenum soils, you may go less, but generally speaking, 2 tonne, 1.5 tonne to 2 tonne per acre. As a rule of thumb, we'd always say every 4 to 5 years, there's a maintenance requirement. 2 tonne every 4 to 5 years, from a point of view of offtakes from meat, milk, and losses through the soil. There's that requirement in any case for maintenance on a lot of soils.
And looking at the time of year we're at now, we're heading into September and late autumn. Is there an opportunity between now and the end of the year to spread lime?
Yeah, so a lot of people, I suppose more historically, have tried to put it back to the end of the year, so you give it a good time to wash in. But the reality of it is there's no bad time to spread lime. There is opportunities throughout the year, even after bales on the grazing platform and after tight grazings, after silage. There is no bad time to get at lime, but ideally it is a good time to do it at the back end of the year if it's not out already.
And how important is record keeping in terms of lime application within derogation circles?
Yeah, so from now on, you'll have to record the quantities of lime spread on the records at the end of the year that you put in with your feed and fertilizer, and the amount of slurry that you've spread also on the records through less. So it's important just to keep the receipts that you've spread in terms of just keep the receipts on file, and you put in the records in terms of the quantities on the records early in the spring before the end of March with your normal fertilizer and meal records.
And moving on to slurry, you brought us nicely to that, Mark, and you mentioned the less or the low emission slurry spreading, this new method and new equipment. Talk through the regulation around that, Mark.
Okay, so there was an easing in period from 2019. This year, the middle of April, requirement to spread slurry with our less equipment. So the likes of the dribble bar, trailing shoe, injection, not that common, the injection method. Dribble bar down this part is the probably the most popular. I suppose just listening to farmers, the big advantage with the less, leaving aside the environment for 1 second, which is probably the most important, but just from a farmer perspective, from what I hear, is it gives great flexibility to spread fertilizer and using a targeted approach, particularly in the spring, where with the splash plate you can't really go into the higher covers or covers that are around 1,000. You can with the dribble bar, so you can target the paddocks that are lower in index, and it gives a more targeted approach. The other, I suppose, advantage from a monetary point of view, there's research from Johnson Castle, every 1,000 gallons of slurry, you can save up to 2 or 3 units of nitrogen that is not lost to the atmosphere. And over a 100-acre farm, at 1,500 gallons per acre is the equivalent of about 3/4 of a tonne of can. So just over one round of slurry, you can save up to a tonne of can by going with the low emission slurry. I suppose the TAMS side of it and the grants in Emma-Louise is, it's shortly running out, but there is up to 40% grants and 60% for young farmers for both new tankers and retrofits. You can retrofit a dribble bar to an existing tanker if the brackets are there.
So there are options there in terms of the financial contribution to either a retrofit or a new tanker. And I guess that the benefits you have highlighted, Mark, in terms of the flexibility in a heavier cover, and also looking at the nitrogen, the additional nitrogen from the slurry product where you're using less equipment, that is relevant to all farmers across all enterprises. Looking then, there is changes to the deadline for slurry export. How does that impact farmers?
Yeah, so the slurry export forms that have to be submitted to the nitrates in Johnson Castle were always the end of the year, the last day of the year. For derogation farmers, that deadline is now gone to the end of October for submitting the form. So it's not a million miles away, them forms. So it's a change for the derogation farmers that are stocked over the 250 or are exporting slurry in any case. When they've applied for derogation is the end of October this year.
So I think it would be quite useful for farmers to contact their dairy advisors, whoever is helping them with that necessary paperwork, fairly immediately. It's you're looking at 6 weeks' time now is the deadline for that. Moving on then to clover, I suppose, Mark, you're based in Clonakilty, so you've seen a widespread use of white clover across the farm there. Can you talk us through the use of clover within reseeded swards for derogation farmers?
Yeah, so it's first, just on the regulation first, there's a requirement to put in 1.5 kg of clover, of seed clover, or 2.5 kg of pelleted clover per bag. I suppose the background in Clonakilty in 2014 to 2017, the 4-year trials that's going on down here, just to summarise, leaving aside the fact that it's environmentally and nitrogen very efficient in terms of fixing nitrogen, just on the grass growth and cow performance, I'd focus on just from a farmer point of view. There's a 7 or 8% increase in grass growth on the grass clover crops down here, which is probably just over a tonne. That benefit really is coming from June the end of May, June onwards, where there was up to 8 kgs dry matter per hectare extra grown on the grass clover paddocks down here. And I suppose from a milk output point of view, there was up to 11% increase in milk solids per cow, which was on average the clover content was 25%, but that varied. It was lower in the spring and peaked a bit higher at the back end of the year. But I suppose the feedback you get from farm is that it is positive. The persistency of it and establishment is difficult, and I know there is a lot of work and more, I suppose, trial work and to try and get it on farm. It is difficult, so there is work. We acknowledge that. But the one thing I would say on it, Emma-Louise, in terms of establishing clover or anyone destroying it, it's very important that the soil fertility, P's and K, and the soil pH and the weed control are under control before anyone would put it in. Because in terms of the sprays and everything else after, to control weed control, it is paramount that the conditions are given the best opportunity to establish itself.
And then looking to crude protein, and there are guidelines for, I suppose, a reduced crude protein during the mid-season or the main grazing season. I suppose to take a step backwards, firstly, Mark, to give us some context, how much crude protein is there in grazed grass?
Generally speaking, with grazed grass, it ranges between 16 to 24% crude protein. But again, that is very much dependent on sward age, sward type, growth stage, and I suppose fertilizer regime and the time of the year. So it does vary, can go below that. Sometimes it'll go higher, but generally speaking, between 16 to 24%. When we look at actual cow crude protein requirements, again, the ranges are probably 16 to 17% crude protein in the overall total diet. This can vary, so that's for grazing animals. Indoor systems are slightly higher maybe, and young stock will have a slightly higher crude protein requirement just for growth. I suppose where it's going this year, the requirement between April and September, the main grazing season, there's a protein cap of 16% crude protein, and next year that's going to 15%. But I suppose in West Cork, I know a couple of the co-ops here historically have had 13-14% crude protein in any case, so the changes are minimal, to be honest. And in an ideal world, the balance with energy and protein within the rumen is the big driver of it, in terms of it costs energy to excrete this extra nitrogen through milk and urine. Some of the co-ops have the milk urea nitrogen level, but I suppose it's costing the farmers to buy it extra protein, it's costing the cow to excrete it, and it's costing the environment also through increased nitrogen excretion. And through the summer, you'll often see in the urine patches the excess nitrogen that cows are excreting through urine isn't helping. Particularly you'll see them in the drier months of the summer.
And you talk about the recommendation for the total diet being anywhere between 16 and 17%. And I suppose taking into account mid-season, a lot of farmers would be feeding maybe 16 to 18 kilograms dry matter of grazed grass with a top-up of concentrate, which is generally, where conditions are good for grass production. They're feeding maybe 1 to 2 kilograms of concentrate. Like, what is your recommendation for a crude protein percentage in a nut or a ration, from April to September?
Metabolically, there's no reason really to be going more than 13 or 14% at that time of the year. When cows are at grass, like if grass through the main grazing season is up around the 20%, overall diet 17%, your 1 kg is only affecting 1 kg of meal is only affecting your overall diet by 5-6%. So it's minimal change it will make. So 13-14% to me is loads.
And as you say, that is available from co-ops or whoever is providing your ration. And I think, look, what you've said, Mark, is very reassuring, because, a lot of farmers might, use the same nut across the full year. But and also, I suppose, heading into April, it's you're getting cows ready for the breeding season, and it's reassuring to hear that the requirement for protein isn't necessarily at the higher end. That's only really when they're, I suppose, in and out, on off grazing, and they have a certain proportion of silage in the diet.
It is worth noting, Emma-Louise, that if they're high, particularly for indoor systems, which there isn't that many, and young stock, if there is higher protein requirements, it needs to be certified by an approved advisor if you're going over and above, I suppose, the 15% next year. So there is discompensations for that.
Looking then to grassland management, I suppose there's a huge variability in terms of the amount of people who are measuring grass, and I suppose the frequency at which they measure grass across the year. From your perspective, Mark, what would you recommend as a frequency for, across the grazing season in terms of the number of grazings, or how frequently, depending on the stage of the grazing season?
I suppose under the derogation there was a minimum requirement of 20 walks per year, but the reality of that is it's probably actually not enough. Well, it's not enough through the main grazing season, the 6 months from April through September. Really, what I find is some of the very best clients that I would have would be walking the farm every week, and sometimes twice a week when the thing is going to take off or has ticked off. I suppose the benefits from what I see from farmers is it keeps being able to keep ahead of the plant, and it's easier to make decisions about taking out surpluses, and it reassures you that you are doing the right thing. Or certainly when feed or the grass starts to slow down, to feed extra when the grass rates are slow. And it also, I suppose, now trying to build covers to see where you're at in terms of building covers. But the biggest thing I would see is the improved utilisation and the actual overall improved quality. That it allows farmers to push the boat a small bit in terms of quality, that they're maximising the amount of energy they're getting into the cow. So ideally you'd be saying once a week for the 6 months, and maybe every 2 weeks then thereafter, and through December, January, when the growth rates are slow. That's the holiday mode.
And for some farmers, Mark, who are dipping their toe in the water, they're starting to grass measure, but they have a limited knowledge. Is there help available to them from Teagasc?
Well, yeah. So I suppose the first thing is the Grass 10, which started a few years ago at this stage. But there's Teagasc run Grass 10 courses right around the regions. So there is help, I suppose, advisors, discussion groups. They are there. Another, I suppose, the biggest where people will learn more is from their other peer farmers. So if you can pick a buddy to even walk the farm with them. We see it down here. There's a couple of farmers meet, 3 or 4 farmers meet a month. They walk to each other's farms, and they just take in turns, and that's how you perfect the art of it. I suppose just on the reasoning for the grassland measurement, the goal is to measure and quantify the measure of grass grown annually, and that is in effect going to help us with the application in 2021, the level of grass that we're actually growing, and that we can quantify what we're growing when we go to the EU to look for a new application.
And outside of the grassland, there's also another training course available, and it's a requirement for derogation farmers. Can you give us some information on that, Mark? Yeah,
so I suppose just it's based an environmental course. Has to be completed by the end of 21. I suppose some of the modules that will be covered will be adopting best practice in nutrient use efficiency and management, which will be looking at the likes of your nutrient management plan, better understanding it. There's a protection of waters, including the water quality, gaseous emissions, biodiversity, and our overall carbon footprint. So that has to be completed by the end of 21, and in current conditions we're in, I suspect they will be next year when them courses are rolled out.
And you mentioned protecting waters, and I guess this is on a side note, but it is associated with grazing. And we would have spoken to Catherine Keena about biodiversity, and part of that, she mentioned, protecting water courses. Can you briefly remind us of the changes, in terms of bovines management around water courses?
Yeah, so this was actually introduced in the last SI document, but it's not coming into effect until the start of next year. So I suppose the new strengthened water protection measure, which is focusing on intercepting and breaking the nutrient transport pathways and preventing sediment entering into the waters. So the first one, I suppose, is the exclusion of bovines from watercourses. So not allowing animals drink from the watercourses. If on farm and if there is access to watercourses on farm, there's a fence requirement of 1.5 meters back from the top of the river bank, where livestock, where they have access to water. If they don't have access to water, if there's a fence there already, that should suffice. These measures are for farmers that with a grassland stocking rate over 170. So it's not just the derogation farmers. And a point to note on the grassland stocking rate, the difference between the grassland stocking rate and the overall stocking rate is your total organic nitrogen divided by the grass. So we'll all have a couple of clients, and there'll be farmers listening, that will be stocked at 160 overall. But if they have 6 or 7% of the farm in cereal or tillage, they will be now gone over the 170. So we'll have to abide by the rules as well. Again, the 170 grassland stocking rate troughs must be 20 meters back from watercourses, so any open waters or small drains. And the last one then, the prevention of direct runoff from farm roadways. So it's basically breaking the pathway of nutrients directly going into streams or waterways. They're the three strengthened measures, I suppose, that are coming into effect next year and will affect roughly probably a third of the bovine numbers in the country, not just the derogation, as I said.
And finally then, to look at commonage, and I guess this is not affecting a lot of farmers within derogation, less than 10% of farmers, but can you give us an idea of the new regulations around commonage and how it will affect dairy farmers in derogation?
Yeah, so I think the numbers are quite small. They're around 300, but basically if you've commonage or rough grazing included on your area aid maps, the limit for both organic nitrogen limit and fertilizer are both at the 170 limits. So it just basically means that where once they were farmed up to 250 organic from a derogation point of view, that now is reduced back to the 170 limit, and the same for the fertilizer allowance is at the 170 limit for those to commonage and rough grazing.
I guess that'll have implications in terms of derogation farmers, the stock numbers that can be carried. I think we've had a really nice chat today, Mark. You've catalogued the practices that farmers need to implement where they're engaging with nitrates derogation. And, I suppose the main aim of this is to protect the environment and, protect the impact of farming on the environment. But I suppose across the conversation, a lot of these practices will have a really positive impact on profitability and sustainability of dairy farms going forward. Thank you, Mark.
Thanks, Emma-Louise.
That's all for this week's episode of the Dairy Edge podcast, and my thanks to Mark O'Sullivan for joining me on this week's show. Don't forget to rate, review and subscribe to the podcast. You can listen on Apple and Google Podcasts as well as Spotify, and for more information go to the Teagasc website at teagasc.ie. I'm Emma-Louise Coffey, and join me next time for your Dairy Edge.